Today's fun vegan feminist mini lecture will be on the politics of vegan cupcakes. So I have here, I've been saving it, a delightful vegan cupcake from my local vegan restaurant. I'm so very privileged and lucky to have one of those down the street. So I've always wanted to write a paper on this topic, and maybe I will. Maybe this will be the video that motivates me to do that. But always too many ideas and never enough time in the world. So anyway, the idea from this, where I first noticed it, I suppose, gosh, time flies, probably 10 years ago when I was working on my dissertation for my PhD. I'll come back to you. And I was looking through some of the direct action discourse from folks like the Animal Liberation Front. Gosh, I can't even remember some of the other old organizations now, grassroots groups, really. But I was looking through it because I was doing a discourse analysis for my PhD, which turned out to be my second book, Piecemeal Protest, Animal Rights in the Age of Nonprofits. And I hadn't gone into the book project or the dissertation project thinking I would be doing anything feminist related. In fact, I really didn't start getting into vegan feminism or incorporating feminism into my animal rights activism and thinking until, well into my PhD, because, sad story, I ended up teaching a gender and society course, which got me, it forced me really to deep dive into some vegan feminist, really just feminist, then later vegan feminist theory. So anyway, that was kind of percolating in the back of my mind. And as I was doing content analysis for this project, through the Animal Liberation Front, publications, zines, whatever else, blogs, I noticed that there was a sort of undercurrent of what I would call misogyny. And I can do a whole nother video on the politics of violent direct action and the Animal Liberation Front and all that kind of stuff. And I've written quite a bit on that in my website, my blog, and as I mentioned in my book. In my first book as well, I touch on this, and certainly other books. It's just kind of a thing for me. But although direct action, especially violent direct action, and when I say violent, I mean we're talking about violently threatening people, threatening to harm people, threatening to kill people, terrorizing people, psychologically intimidating. All of this is the intent is to get them to stop doing speciesist industries, which whether or not it's effective is a different argument, but and also using property damage and bombs and blowing up things and catching things on fire, all of which what I would say is pretty violent. Again, whether or not that's effective is a different talk, different video. But for today's purposes, I think it's pretty clear that there is a masculine macho undertone to that type of activism. So fine, whatever. One of the big things with the ALF and other similar organizations and grassroots collectives is that they take this kind of live and let live motto, where a lot of that happens in the animal rights movement, and it's another thing that I've written quite a lot about is factionalism and what to do with it. But it's the sort of live and let live motto. But of course, those who are in a privileged position and who have typically been privileged with their position being valorized, normalized, rewarded, they say that, but they really, when they're saying they want unity, they're expecting other people to unify with them, and that they are somehow above criticism, and they don't mind whatsoever turning around and criticizing other groups, other factions, and other approaches. And that tends to be the case with the Animal Liberation Front, the direct action folks, also professionalized organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, unity until they have a problem with somebody else, and then they're allowed to voice their disagreement. So that's what today's video is about. And I keep saying the Animal Liberation Front, but when I say the ALF, really what I'm meaning is it's kind of a catch-all term for all of these groups that were really big in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, started to die off when we turned into the 21st century. It's still around a little bit, but I think it's kind of passé, if you will, in the animal rights movement for a lot of reasons. Again, a different video. Anyhow, so as I'm doing this discourse analysis and specifically looking for disagreements, so this is one I didn't expect to really find, but now with hindsight, yeah, of course I did. Of course I did, because it's a super macho group. What I saw was quite a lot of digs at cupcake advocacy. And this, for people, especially baby vegans, people who are new to the animal rights movement, new to veganism, who are maybe even Gen Z folks or younger, cupcakes were, they were like a big deal. They were a big deal. So when I was a youngin', when I was a university student, this book came out and it just blew up the vegan movement. It was such a cultural sort of icon. And this is because back in the day, believe it or not, and this is in the United States, you couldn't just go to the grocery store and buy vegan pastries or vegan really anything except fruit and vegetables. If you wanted it vegan, you had to go to a major metropolis like New York City. Back then, even Las Vegas didn't have anything. Like, I remember it was a huge deal when I was a university student that way out in Chinatown, I think it's on Spring Lake Road or something, in the desert, way beyond main city center, Las Vegas. There was a place called Ronald's Donuts, which is probably still open. It was run by some Buddhist folks, some Buddhist Asian American folks, and a lot of their donuts were vegan. And I would, every time I'd visit Las Vegas, I would go out of my way. Either if I was driving, I would drive. It's like 30 miles from the strip. So, I mean, it's a long haul just to go get your vegan donuts. That's what us old timers had to do if we wanted sweets. So when this book came out, it was a big deal because, wow, now you can empower yourself and make your own cupcakes. And by the way, we're talking about the early 2000s. You couldn't just go on the internet and find recipes. There really weren't any. So it was a whole different wild, wild west of vegan living. So I think that this background is important because it wasn't just that we're talking about cooking and baking. We're talking about making veganism obtainable and accessible in a world that's very volatile towards anything plant-based, right? This is 20 some years ago. So when this book came out, everybody got the book. We got the book. I was doing animal rights activism at my university. We got the book and we would make cupcakes from it. And what we would do, and this is quite typical of the time, we would go out into community spaces. So in our case, we would go to the middle of campus during classes, and we would sometimes sell them. I think sometimes we gave them away, but I think because we were poor university students and what hicks we were, we didn't even know that you could apply to the university for student club funding. Like I should do a whole video on that for people who are doing student activism, because I was just a little hillbilly from Appalachia. I didn't know that you could have money for student activism. So anyway, sometimes we would charge for the cupcake, but just to kind of make our money back so that we could afford the flour and sugar and stuff. Like, sad times, wasn't it? So anyhow, so this was a big part of our activism, and it wasn't just me in Virginia. I know that I had activist friends who were in, say, Colorado. I had activist friends who were even in like Australia, New Zealand, who were doing that. And we basically kind of summarized this as Cupcake for Conversation. So when we did it as a bake sale, even we were selling it for like nothing, right? We're just saving it, trying to raise a little bit of money to do stuff, but pay ourselves back for the ingredients and then like do stuff, buy posters and things like that. But a lot of folks would do it and just say, well, let's have a conversation, that's all. And it depends. Like if you're in a certain place and you see free cupcakes, like I think nowadays that's it's not as wild and awesome as it would have been back then, but just to have free food like that, free cupcakes, and if you're a student as well. So they would go pretty quick. So that was the idea. The idea was to say, because food, there's social psychology on this. If you use food as an exchange, it oftentimes lowers people's guard and they're more willing to have conversations if you're interested in persuasion. It's also helpful because it demonstrated that, wow, vegan cupcakes don't taste any different. Veganism is not going to make your jaw fall off or your bowels to explode or whatever people thought maybe vegan food would do. So it served a lot of functions with these cupcakes. First off, for vegans, it was really nice to actually have something yummy because we didn't have that luxury. For non-vegans, it was a way for us to open up conversation with them and also to show them that vegan food was not all that bad. Right. So that was the idea behind the cupcake, conversation for a cupcake. And really, cupcakes they're an icon, aren't they? I would say in the past 20 years, cupcakes have not decreased in popularity and mainstream public. And actually, they've kind of become part of the iconography of not just millennials like me, but Gen Z. Like you see stickers and GIFs and emojis and all that kind of stuff that center on cupcakes, because what do they represent? Something sweet, something fun. And I thought that was a really clever way to approach vegan activism. Okay, so that's the sociology of it, the background of it. But now let's go into the feminism of it. Let's be honest, when we're looking at cupcakes and cooking, baking, that is deeply, deeply coded as feminized, right? And so certainly the authors of this book, Chandra, Moskowitz, and Terry Hope Romero, and sorry for mispronouncing that amazing Jewish name. These two women were really, really pivotal in pushing vegan pop culture in the United States 20, 25 years ago, and put out quite a few cookbooks. So the idea was that this is quite feminized, right? That's what women do. Women are baking and cooking and caring and feeding, which isn't that what veganism is really all about? It's about reclaiming food and reclaiming that kind of social aspect of nurturing and feeding and caring and sustaining your community and your family and your friends, right? And yourself. But unfortunately, in a patriarchal culture in which we live, that has been quite feminized and degraded as a result. So that leads me back to the ALF and the violent direct action folks. I saw this surfacing quite a bit in their blogs from around this era, the early 2000s. Now, mind you, this is a point in time when their popularity as direct action, violent blow up things, yell at people's faces, threaten to beat them with a baseball bat, all these things are true. That was waning in popularity in the movement for a lot of reasons. We're talking about post 9/11, where there was really no tolerance whatsoever for anything like that in the United States and elsewhere. It had a global chilling effect in that way. But also the animal rights movement at that time had begun seriously to transition to a professionalized approach. So these grassroots groups, these sort of DIY organizations and individuals, they lost platform because now it was more towards this corporate business, like let's work with the state instead of against the state type of strategy with the animal rights movement, which is where we're living today. So here we are 25 years later, and we're very much so professionalized movement space. Well, in their sort of downfall, the animal liberation folks really were not pleased with that, and they started to take that out on cupcakes. I saw that basically, and saying that this cupcakeism is ineffective activism. So with the downfall of the ALF, they basically started to lash out at other folks, and were really upset because of disunity and lack of respect. And then they were perfectly happy to turn around and dish it out to the cupcake approach, cupcake activism, which, by the way, is more approachable to people who are not white adult men or white adult middle class men who can afford to basically risk their freedom and face the police in the United States. And also, cupcake activism is more approachable to women, right? So this is a type of activism that makes everybody feel safe and comfortable, and it's still pushing conversations, but it's not, in the face of the police. It's not in the face of the state. It's not blowing up things or threatening people, and it's a whole different way of doing activism. And so they kind of lashed out on that. So that's the politics, the background of it. And one of the things I don't think we recognize, though, is that this is a deeply sexist sort of attitude. So we're also dealing with a social movement that is a majority female and yet majority male rule in the movement. So the higher up you go in organizations, the more likely you are to find men. The better paid positions, more powerful positions tend to be given to men. Women are making less money than men in these organizations, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at speaking engagements, when you look at conferences, the Animal Rights Hall of Fame, all that kind of stuff that will create platform and legitimacy for folks in the animal rights movement, it tends to be dominated disproportionately by men. So when we are also adding in this sort of vitriolic, misogynist, anti-cupcake stuff, I think that also is adding to that sexism. So I hereby say, bring back the cupcakes. As a sociologist, I can tell you that food is, it's nobody eats alone. This is what my dissertation advisor, Michael Carolyn, who's not a vegan, but he specializes in the sociology of food. My dissertation advisor had a book called No One Eats Alone. And I think that's quite a clever title, a clever way to look at the sociology of food. Because when we eat, we're tying ourselves into all these complex relationships and systems and institutions that may not be in this little box, but all that had to take place for this to get to be. And so I think that food is a wonderful way, a bridge into thinking about these larger conversations of systemic inequalities, oppression, et cetera, but cupcakes in particular are fun and tasty. I think cupcakes help us to cope with some really heavy topics, and so it really can lighten the load for activists and the person having the conversation on the other side who's considering veganism, who's maybe not thought about it before. It can make it a little bit easier and sweeter on them as well. And I think it's also, by the way, this is my last spiel on feminism with cupcakes, before I take a bite out of this sucker, is that one of the things that feminism is offered to us is this idea that, not an idea, a birthright really, that we as human beings, sentient beings on this planet, we also have a right to experience pleasure and to not feel as though we always have to restrain ourselves or to go without or to deny ourselves. Those values are coming out of a patriarchal, sort of heavily religious culture that we're living in the West. And it's also coming out of a capitalistic society that wants us to sort of deny. In some ways, it's asking us to consume. But really, one of the ways, if you look at the work of Max Weber, one of the ways that capitalism was able to take off in the West is because of this culture of denial and self-sacrifice. And so feminism has pushed back on that in the past few decades and said, actually, what if we did the opposite and we embraced being alive, embraced our capacity to feel pleasure, and not always just focus on the negative. And so this is one of the great things about the vegan movement, vegan culture, is that we are so dealing with all this really negative, horrible knowledge, right? That what's happening to non-human animals, focusing on food sometimes, really good food, sometimes naughty food, that, cupcakes were. I think that's a wonderful time to just say, okay, but here's something nice and positive and sweet that I can relish in and just, at least for a moment, take pleasure in being alive. As we're human beings too, we also need to practice some self-care in order to sustain ourselves in this movement. So there you go. That's my spiel on cupcakes. Maybe try that out. Try this. Let's bring it back, because I haven't actually seen this campaigning in a while. Cupcake for a Conversation, where let's make some cupcakes. The act of making cupcakes itself, I think, is a nice little moment of self-care. It doesn't actually take that long to make cupcakes. The icing is the bit that gets on my nerves, because you have to get the right butter-fat combination. And currently, right now where I'm living, they stopped making the vegan shortening, and I'm in England, and that's not as a big thing as it is in the United States. But anyway, something simple that we can do, and I just thought that you'd be interested in knowing that history, the political history of cupcakes and the vegan movement, and also the sort of nasty, sexist side story that has plagued it there for a little bit. But I think mostly then we can forget about that, right? And just focus on the nice part. And how about this? It's a feminist act when we eat vegan cupcakes. Oh, so good.